Welcome back, everybody. Another episode of Dynasty Leverage. And today we are going to talk about what to do if you believe your draft pick next year's class in your 12-team Superflex League is going to be outside of the top six, specifically looking at 109 through 112. So the team that you expect to get to at least the semifinals. And I think we all acknowledge once you get to the final four of your league, there's a lot of variance that takes over. It basically comes down to who wins, the massive blow up games during those 2 weeks in the fantasy playoffs. But this is going to be about data based, and it's going to look at what to do if you have those picks 109 through 112. And I'm going to focus on what the current data looks like for next year. Forget about the players. There's so much that can happen between now and next offseason where the player names in these slots may change. But I think it's important to look at some current mock draft data and figure out, what does the positional slotting look like for next year's class. So that's what I did. I went to three popular mock draft sites, one being Mock Draft Database, which gathers a bunch of other mock drafts, and then two others, DraftWire and Draft Countdown. And I basically came up with essentially like a consensus number of where players are going in these slots. So let's focus on the 109 through the 112. So you have a team, you think you have a late first round pick. You're holding your pick. You think it's going to be late. You want to maybe try to shop it before the season, or at least early on in the season, to see what you can get and try to capitalize on the fact that a lot of people are hyping up this class to be very top heavy. And I think the data backs that up. So let me first go into the data, then we'll go into some of the strategies if you think you're holding one of these picks. So right now, if you just look at the consensus data, we have two quarterbacks, two wide receivers, and one running back based on their draft capital next year that are almost assuredly going to go before your 109 through 112. So we're talking about Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Kayshon Boutte, Bijan Robinson. That's five. Those are five players based on their projected draft capital. The first four, all top 10 picks. And then you have Bijan, that if he goes inside the top 15 or even the top 20 at running back, that will immediately, especially with his hype, that will immediately push him to where he's never going to go below like the top 1, 2, or 3 picks in a rookie draft. So that's effectively five players that probably are going to be out of reach if you have these picks. Now, the person you may be trying to shop your playoff pick to next year probably acknowledges they're not going to get one of the top 3 or 4 players in the class, right? If they look at your team and they say, hey, you're probably going to be a contender. You're going to be a team that can make the playoffs. I'm not getting CJ Stroud. I'm not getting Jackson Smith-Njigba. I'm not getting Bijan Robinson with that pick. However, looking at some of the other data, what can you expect if you trade away this pick? What can you expect that they may think that they're getting with this pick? And also, if you're going to trade for picks, that's another thing. Trying to gauge what you may be able to get with these picks. So right now, if you just omit those five players, a couple other things stood out to me. So the next thing is we have a few other wide receivers that were almost consensus round 1 picks. These names, Quentin Johnston, Jordan Addison, Josh Downs. Now, Josh Downs and Jordan Addison are smaller slot receivers. So, kind of think like better versions of Jahan Dotson, maybe better versions with higher pedigree than somebody like Sky Moore. But that's kind of what you're looking at. And I think typically we look at those types. If you're a first round receiver, you're going to be probably a first round rookie pick. And it's really just going to depend on what running backs and what quarterbacks are ahead of you to where people are going to decide to take them in the mid first or late first. So I think that's something comfortably you can look at with these picks and say, okay, if I'm stuck with the 109, 110, 111, or 112, there are going to be at least 2, maybe 3 other first round consensus receivers, at least based on the averages right now, but let's conservatively say 2. That's going to be almost the fallback option for you at one of these picks. So if you're sitting there thinking about trading one of these picks for a wide receiver that has similar pedigree right now, kind of think about that and say, before I trade my late 23 first for Rashad Bateman or Elijah Moore or Devontae Smith, kind of think about you're probably going to be able to get the same type of player next year with that pick. And that's if you're unfortunate. That's if things don't break your way and you end up having to settle for a wide receiver. So that's something to think about. That doesn't mean you don't make the move, but also just kind of look at this from like a zoomed out view and say, I'm not really getting a shot on a quote unquote higher leverage player. We talk about all the time that wide receivers aren't really leverage players in Dynasty. If you hit on the uber elite ones, yes. If you hit on, I mentioned a guy like Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman's interesting because he's somebody that everything screams that he's probably never going to be a wide receiver one in Dynasty. But I also acknowledge he has kind of like a CD Lamb aspect to his profile. If he went out and had a top 12 season this year, the Dynasty community already liked him so much, and he was a first round pick, and he's pretty much the alpha on his own roster. We could see him move up into the top 8, top 10 wide receivers in Dynasty. So I think there is part of his evaluation where you say, okay, I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver one, but if he went out and had a 1,200-yard season and he finished like as a top 15 receiver, the community would bump him up. So you would have an asset that at that point is probably worth more than one of these late 23 firsts. So think about that. But the idea being, you're not necessarily guaranteed to be able to flip your roster construction by moving one of these picks for a wide receiver, because it's not guaranteed that this pick could turn anything other than, okay, I'm just going to take another round one receiver. So think about that before you make the move. Now, I think the wild card in that is we have a couple other quarterbacks. So we have Will Levis coming off the board, consensus a first round pick. Tyler Van Dyke coming off the board, a consensus first round pick. And then a couple of these have Cam Ward, who's very intriguing. But let's just use Cam Ward as a placeholder of maybe a fifth quarterback that could jump into the first round, especially if Stroud and Young are locks inside the top 5. You're going to have a couple others that slowly move their way up. And that's right now the favorites are Van Dyke and Levis. That's 4. So if you have 2 more quarterbacks go in the first round, and then you have just a gluttony of names that could easily slip into the first round of the NFL draft, all of a sudden, your 109 through 112 became a lot more intriguing. Now what you possibly have is an option. You have an option to take, okay, I can take Jordan Addison. I can take Jermaine Burton. I can take Quentin Johnston. I can take Josh Downs. Whatever receivers go in the first round, I can take one of those guys, but I also have the option of taking Will Levis or Tyler Van Dyke. So you now see if there's more quarterbacks that go, your pick doesn't necessarily get a better player or guarantee a better player, but you are giving up some of that flexibility of having the option. You're sitting there at the 110. You might have an option of a round 1 quarterback and a round 1 receiver. And to me, that's more valuable than just having to settle for the wide receiver. Even if they went in the top 20 of the NFL draft, you want to have those options, because not every roster it's going to make sense to say, hey, I just want another receiver. You may be saying, hey, I want to trade for another quarterback, or maybe I need to get, some new blood in my quarterback room. So think about that. That's another aspect of what you may be trading away, even if you trade away one of these late picks. Running backs. So running backs, again, we talked about quarterbacks and running backs are what drives the value of these later picks. If you have one of these later picks, you are rooting for as many running backs to go in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft. You're rooting for as many quarterbacks to go in the first round of the NFL draft. That's going to push the value to you to where even if you don't get guaranteed better players, I just said it, you have more options. So let's look at the running backs. So after Bijan, obviously, we then have Jahmyr Gibbs. So Jahmyr Gibbs coming off the board at around pick 36. So we're talking the very early part of the second round. And I think that's accurate. Everybody I've seen basically has him inside the top 50. If Jahmyr Gibbs is a top 50 pick, we are going to look at him as like James Cook plus 25%. He has the pedigree. He's going to be coming from Alabama. He's going to be seen as one of these guys. If I don't get Bijan, he's essentially the 1B. He's going to be the consolation prize, and it's going to be a consolation prize based on his hype. Since he came into college, he is going to be probably a top 5 pick. So that's another guy. I should have almost mentioned him in there with Bijan and Smith-Njigba and Boutte and Stroud and Young. Like, he's going to be a guy that's going to be, if he gets top 50 draft capital, he will almost be a consensus top 6, top 7 rookie pick, which means at your 109 through 112, you are not going to be able to get Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, that is good, though, for, again, the value of your picks. Now, after Jahmyr Gibbs, you have some other wild cards. You have Zach Evans coming off the board right now in the top 50. So Zach Evans, that's almost the equivalent of like another Javonte Williams or Kenneth Walker. Now think about where they went in their respective classes. Obviously, Walker went higher because the 2022 class was weaker. Javonte went a little bit lower because he wasn't even a top 6 pick in his class. So he was a guy that went at the 107, 108, 109, 110 in 2021. I think that's Zach Evans. If he gets this draft capital, he's going to be one of those guys that maybe moves up into that range a little bit due to the scarcity of the position. But that there's going to be people that are at the 109, 110 that have a shot of getting a guy like Zach Evans. So just picture, it'd be nice to add a Javonte Williams or Kenneth Walker to your running back room, and you're getting that in the late first. And I think that's possible just given where the other positions fall. And then after that, there's a couple other running backs that could threaten to go in the second round. Tank Bigsby right now coming off the board right around pick 50. So I don't know if he gets top 50 draft capital, but at least this data says that he might. If he does, he's essentially another version of Zach Evans. So I think Zach Evans and Tank Bigsby they're wild cards. If they go inside the top 50, even like top 55, you're looking at similar draft capital to J.K. Dobbins, A.J. Dillon, Cam Akers, and their Devy prospects are going to actually back that up. People are going to want those guys just as they wanted J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers and DeAndre Swift. Like they're going to be the same thing in the eyes of the community. And what happened back in 2020? Every one of those running backs got pushed way up. I mean, you weren't getting one of those guys if you didn't have a top 8 rookie pick. Now, we treat the running backs a little differently now, and we treat the quarterbacks a little bit differently. Those drafts, Justin Herbert fell outside of the top 8 for a lot of people. I don't think people will make that mistake now. But again, if you tell me there's going to be 4 top 50 running backs next year, or at least just 4 running backs in the first 2 rounds, given who they are, Bijan, Gibbs, Bigsby, Evans, those have been the names for at least 2 years at this point. And people will treat them as such in rookie drafts. So you're sitting there at the 109 through 112. If that happens, you're now looking at, especially if you're at that 109, 110, you're looking at an option of taking, okay, I can take a running back similar to like J.K. Dobbins type pedigree. I can take a quarterback similar to maybe Mac Jones type pedigree, something like that. You're going to have options to take a round 1 quarterback. Or you can take a wide receiver that is a first round pick, similar to, it can be a wide variety of guys. I won't even put names because the point isn't even to say who's going to be good and who's not. But you can see the magic of those late firsts, and they're why the 23 firsts are so valuable. This exercise I'm going through, it's not because this class is going to produce more than these other classes. It's that if you're sitting even with these late firsts, you have potential to be in a spot where you have options to hit any of the 3 core positions. This doesn't even get into Michael Mayer. Okay, so Michael Mayer, a tight end, is a consensus top 20, top 15 pick in the NFL draft. So if the class wasn't strong enough, you now throw in another TJ Hawkinson, Noah Fant level prospect. I won't even put in Kyle Pitts. But you throw in like a Hawkinson or Fant into the draft, that's going to be another pick that in certain formats, people will take him in the first round. So again, if you're in the right format, especially some of these formats like I talked about on the last Dynasty Leverage, talking about the tight ends, if you're in like a 1.75 tight end premium league and you're sitting at the 111, Michael Mayer's probably going to be there on the board. And if he's not, someone else is going to take him and push value back to you. So think about that. If your league actually values tight ends, and I said 1.75, 2 PPR, or any form of start 2, I think it's viable. If you're in any of those leagues, your late firsts are even more valuable for this reason, that Michael Mayer is going to be a first-round pick. So again, think about this before you trade these picks away. It's not necessarily the player you're giving up. It's the leverage and the option that you may have with the pick and the future opportunity that you have by holding the pick between now and next May, what you could do with the pick at that point. And you obviously have to decide, do you want to give that up and take the points this season? Or do you want to wait and make an even bigger move potentially next offseason. So you have to read your league, but I think I've laid out kind of the pros and cons. The pros of holding these picks is that based on this data right now, and obviously this can change after the college football season, based on this data, even your late firsts are going to be in positions where you have options. You have options to potentially hit all 4 positions in Dynasty with a very high pedigree player. Now, you may not like the player, but on the clock, you're going to say, okay, I have an option of literally taking a running back, quarterback, receiver, or tight end that fit the capital of basically what you would want a top 12, top 10, top 8 rookie pick to be. And you're going to have a shot of taking maybe any of the 4. That's valuable. That's valuable because you never know who may say, you know what, I have to get Michael Mayer. I have to get Tank Bigsby. I have to get Will Levis, whatever it is. But you have the power of those picks. So you have to decide. Obviously, the cons are you hold on to the pick. Even if this comes to fruition, you're probably giving up a lot of opportunities between now and that time to get points on your roster. And if you play in a large number of leagues like me, like you're playing a large portfolio, my personal strategy with these late firsts is I'm strategically trying to trade some of them away. But I also acknowledge if it's not the perfect kind of deal, I'm not rushing to trade these late firsts because there's fear that the late firsts next year aren't going to be viable picks. You hear a lot of people say, oh, after the top 7 or 8 picks next year, it gets a little murky. It doesn't matter if it gets murky in terms of you don't know what players to pick. It's not going to be murky in terms of the pedigree options that are going to be on the board. So I'm targeting to trade some of these away, but I'm also being very strategic. What I need is maybe I buy a player and I try to also get back a second. Maybe I buy 2 players with my pick. What I don't want to do is necessarily give up my 23 first, even if I project it to be late, for a single non-core asset that I don't think is also going up in value. So even a guy like Rashad Bateman, I'm not paying a 23 first for Rashad Bateman. I don't care if you tell me it's almost guaranteed to be one of the bottom 3 or 4 picks. I don't see a reason to necessarily do that move right now. What I'm probably looking at is, can I get Rashad Bateman, but then you also throw in, I don't know, somebody like Damian Harris, something like that. Like, give me the real leverage where I have multiple outs to win on this deal. And I also have multiple outs to where even if one of the players I get disappoints, I still have at least another backup asset to go. That's why I said if you can get even like a 24 second thrown into a trade, along with a player you think is barely worth a first, those are the type of leverage moves that I'm trying to make. I'm not sending a 23 first for Mike Evans. I'm not sending a 23 first for Joe Mixon. And people go, oh, those guys are worth first. They might be, but why make that trade right now? Given what I just talked about these picks, why make that trade even with your late first right now when you can probably hold on to that until week 5 of the NFL season and kind of see like which one of the Joe Mixons or Dalvin Cooks or Austin Ecklers of the world are going to actually emerge healthy and their situation looks ripe for a ton of fantasy points the rest of the year. That's when I'll maybe make that move. We have to reassess it once we get some information. But right now, July, it makes no sense to do a 1-for-1 trade like that when you're giving up a 23 first. So people have kind of criticized me and said, you're way too stringent on what players you'll buy for 23 firsts. And I agree with that. But that take is actually going to loosen as we get closer to the season and as we get to the season. I understand that there's going to be more information. The market is going to shift. But right now, I just don't see the reason. Even if you say I have a great team, hold on to your late 23 picks unless you are getting some leverage back. And the leverage usually is going to come in the form of some sort of 2-for-1. Don't do a 1-for-1 for one player. There's just too many outs with that deal that can go wrong for you and can go right for the other teams. Now, I'll flip it real quick before we end the video. If you're buying these picks, a lot of times people will listen to a video like this, or maybe they'll listen to other content creators and they'll say, okay, I'm going to have a late first. I see it all the time. I'm in a ton of Discord chats, a ton of GroupMe chats, a ton of Slack groups. And a lot of them are, oh, that's a late 23 first. I'll send that away for one player. I'm still, even on contending teams, on teams that are already loaded, I'm still the one that's kind of willing to make that move. I'm willing to send my Devontae Smith for a 23 first. I'm willing to make that trade, even if I have a good team and I'm looking at, well, I don't really want to lose points out of my lineup. I'm willing to actually buy some 23 firsts for those type of trades because it gives me the flexibility of just what I talked about if you have your own picks. So think about that too. Even if you're a contending team, take advantage of people that are willing to throw around these perceived late 23 firsts now for one player. If you can do a 1-for-1 and you pick up the pick, a lot of times there's a lot more outs for you to win that trade. And guess what? One of the outs is that team's not as good as they think. And that pick is the 105 or the 106. And all of a sudden, you're talking about one of these like heavy hitting prospects. You're talking about one of these like top 15 or better NFL draft pick prospects, which only existed this year basically with like Breece Hall. And that's it. There wasn't anybody else. So, I mean, almost think about if you end up with the 104 or 105, you get the equivalent of maybe a guy like Breece Hall or maybe a guy like Justin Fields from a couple years ago. And I know Justin Fields is in a little different spot right now, but at the time, if you would have got him at like 105 or 106, you're like, wow, that's an amazing deal. And I think that's what you're set up if you end up kind of betting against one of these teams that's willing to ship off their 23 first, and then boom, they end up giving you the 105 or the 106. You're in a prime position to absolutely smash that deal, especially if you traded away Devontae Smith or Cortland Sutton or something like that, a player that has a little bit of hype, and somebody could squint and say, okay, I'll give up a 23 first for that player. And if it's 1-for-1, more often than not, until we get to the midst of the season, making those deals when you're selling the player for the 23 first is advantageous. So look at your teams, look at this strategy, try to figure out maybe where you can take advantage of it in one league and then maybe buy a pick in another league, and you end up kind of winning the best of both sides on each one of those deals. So I'll be back with some other videos in the future, but I appreciate you guys. Hashtag Dynasty Leverage. Thanks to Clay with Dynasty Pandemic. And obviously check out our flagship show, which is Dynasty Trades in 5. Be chill, everybody.